kind of private investor who is now, and we're increasingly seeing, willing to reach into their private capital pocket beyond their philanthropic funding. It's a sort of win-win model that we've come across in terms of the risk investor is able to recover their capital along with a return. The outcome funders de-risk their investment, and service providers are able to actually have the flexibility to innovate, to achieve the results in whatever way they need to make whatever tweaks to strategy as required, and it really therefore promotes and rewards innovation at a very local level. So a couple of things just to sort of a few remarks I'd like to conclude with are that this takes a lot of hard work, and I'm not saying that development impact bonds are sort of silver bullet solution. They're just an example of innovation. But what is very core to any kind of innovation is the involvement of stakeholders and partnership. And we have really found that it's time now to sort of put aside ideological debates about public versus private, and really we actually have run out of time to address the learning crisis, and partnership will remain key to sort of fostering an environment where innovation is allowed and rewarded.
Right. So thank you to the four of you. We've had a lot of interesting points that came out. The point on accountability, public-private partnerships, which again Han covered and spoke about the importance of looking at the partnerships more lucratively. Safina's point on monitoring, evaluation, outcomes, shifting from just looking at inputs but also looking at outcomes and what are people also delivering, not just what's the impact on learning, but are people delivering what they expected to. And of course, I mean, we can never overemphasize the importance of school leaders and teachers, which, Gayatri very correctly said. I mean, we've been, like, I know my grandmom used to tell me when I was a kid that Guru Vakyam Satyam, and we wonder if we have those gurus or can we train them. At this point, I would like to turn to Mr. Anil Swaroop, who's been patiently listening to all us women. And
what else?
So quoting you, I follow you on Twitter, and quoting you, you said that for ideas to fructify and sustain, it needs to be politically acceptable, socially desirable, technically feasible, and financially viable. Do you think that the ideas that we've raised here, which are obviously powerful because each one of them are working on the field with these ideas, can be scaled? What sort of public-private partnerships are required to scale them and to actually integrate them in public policy making in India? Thank you.
First of all, my compliments for putting together practitioners. Is coming to Harvard Business School, I was wondering whether I'll be the academicians telling me what to do. The people who've done things on the ground like here. The only problem that I have with some of your panelists, I don't get to meet them in Delhi. I've been trying very hard. So the consequence has been, they have done good work in pockets. For some of them, 15,000 is a huge number. For me, it's 250 million children. So you can continue to do 50, 30, 45, until and unless you partner aggressively with the government, you will not scale, you'll continue to get awards world over. You'll continue to travel. And I'm throwing it as a challenge to you, because on a number of occasions, I have indeed approached some of the NGOs, the others are not. I'll give you examples where we've actually scaled. One example I gave during that session there, until unless we think in terms of scaling the good work, it will be only for papers and books. So one thing that needs to be done is scaling. And for scaling, we have to look at how can you scale? What does it take to scale? And you have to go a step before that. I mean, when the lady spoke, the first lady who spoke, I have been hearing that for past 1 year. I've been told about a particular survey that has also happened, which talks about how things are wrong in the country. They've been saying that for the years. What we have to see is, why hasn't it happened? If there is something wrong, let's dig deep into finding why of it. And once you understand the why of it, I think solutions are forthcoming. They are already forthcoming. I'll give a few examples to you. As I said during my talk there, the solutions are actually available in the country. Whether it relates to girls' education, whether it relates to teachers' education, whether it relates to leadership education, solutions are available, and some of those that are providing solutions are present here. I have personally interacted with no less than 100 NGOs at length. While traveling through the country, we discovered 110 models in 24 states of the country. We had a workshop where each model was discussed at length. We picked up 24 such models which are replicable, took them back to the states. Unfortunately, Educate Girls could not be a part of it, but others are. 24 models went back and they're scaling. One example I gave you earlier, I can give you many more examples. So the key word is scaling, that is one. Number two, I'll go back to the point that you made, quoting me. You know, there is no dearth of ideas, at least in India. Almost everyone seems to have a solution to the problem. Everyone, yet it's not happening on the ground. The reason is very simple. People say that, you know, there was a suggestion that why doesn't government do away with the government teachers and hand it over to the private sector. I'm not very sure whether that's the solution, but let's for the sake of argument say, if that were the case, will it be politically possible for the Indian government to do that? Something which may be eminently desirable may not be feasible. And you have to understand the context, and that's why things don't happen. So the solutions have been there, they have not happened, because first, in some cases, it was not politically acceptable. In some other cases, it was not technologically feasible. For example, people who haven't seen the countryside of India will give a technology-related solution and say, there is internet, someone talked about the mobile phone, why can't we start teaching and use technology to... I'm not saying that's the solution to the problem, but assuming for the sake of argument, if it is, we don't have the bandwidth to reach out to the school that way. So as I said, we have to look at these problems, and then the financial bit. I don't know how much money will come from so many trillion dollars to India and how much will go for education. But I don't think we have the amount of money that we require. So given these limitations, are there models available that are working on the ground? And we have two very successful examples in this room. They have made it happen on the ground, given the limitations. In my understanding, at least the Educate Girls model is definitely scalable. Someone has to sit down and find, I have said that in the 2 meetings that I've had with Educate Girls, please come and sit, let's discuss scale. In fact, some of the NGOs have run away because they don't want to listen to this word scale. Because the moment you scale, the real problems come up. You know, in India, we have a saying that pilots don't fly literally and otherwise. So for every project, you set up a pilot. And that pilot succeeds. Like an NGO doing in a particular area succeeding and telling the rest of the world, if this is working, why is it not working elsewhere? No. When you scale, the real test of a particular idea is when you start scaling it. And that's where, going back to the original point that I was making, let us try and understand, number one, if it has not happened, why it has not. I can go into that. I can speak for half an hour to explain to you why it has not happened. I can explain to you what exactly are we doing in terms of making it happen, along with NGOs, because I do believe, as I said earlier, government alone cannot deliver education in the country. It has to be a public-private partnership. And there will be various methods of evolving a public-private partnership. And we are doing that very extensively, very, very extensively. We have recently, I'll just make one more statement and then I close. We have recently launched a portal called Shala Sathi. What is that portal? That portal allows an NGO to register itself, CSR funding agencies to register itself, state governments to register themselves. Once that happens, the projects of state government, and they are sufficiently sensitized now, because I've been traveling and they've understood this, they're putting up their projects on the portal. CSR funding agencies are having a look at those projects. NGOs are backing those projects. The credentials of NGOs are developed there. The credentials of the projects are developed there. The project itself can be monitored transparently on that portal. It's just been a month and there's virtually a revolution happening. More than 14, 15 CSR funding agencies have registered. All states have registered. About 40 NGOs have registered, and it's happening there. So the problem is humongous. As I said, 250 million children, 1.5 million schools, 4.5 million teachers. It's a huge problem. It cannot be done in a manner that we give an example, it's happened here, unless we understand that example, understand why that has happened, also understand how it can be scaled. And in scaling, we clearly define and determine the roles, respective roles of state government, of the NGO, of the central government, and what are the interventions required, whether there's a legislative intervention required, whether there's an executive intervention required, whether there's a financial intervention required. We've gone into those details with regard to a large number of projects, and hopefully it should take off. But again, as I said, scale is the word. Good things are happening. If you don't scale them, they will continue to be good, but the country will not benefit. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for bringing our attention to scalability and the fact that the efforts are already in place. On that note, I would like to open the floor for audience questions. Maybe we could take 3 to 4 comments together, and the panelists could then decide, who would want to answer.
Hey, good evening, and it is really wonderful to hear so much of knowledge within this room, and I really appreciate the kind of work you all are doing, and it's really encouraging, and I hope the future is very good. And thanks, Gayatri, from ISLI. I am Manavendranath Sanyal. I am from Pune, and we have worked with the government a lot to improve. But Mr. Anil Swarup, I would like to ask you one question that we really find very challenging. When you talk of scale, there are multiple factors that affect in a pilot you are working within a limited environment, but when you try to scale it up, there are multiple factors that affects. One is the local political interventions are there, the bureaucracy changes in the transfer. You yourself mentioned that transfer in the bureaucracy is another problem, because I remember that in last 10 years that I have worked with them, 5 of the municipal commissioners changes, and that really affects the work. It's all the effort you have to again restart the thing. So how can we address these issues? It's really important that if we are talking about scaling, there has to be a system-driven process through which these things can work out. And of course, there are multiple factors like school leaders, then there are girls' education, community, everything has to be taken into consideration. So I think that's very important when you are talking about scaling, how you can think on all those factors so that you can implement it wherever is possible. And I think it's important that it should be system-driven. Thanks.
I'm going to cover this side of the room first, the center first.
Hi, thank you everyone. It was very inspiring to listen to all of you. My question is for Mr. Swarup. So as we were talking about the Development Impact Bond and the sheer number of students who were positively impacted in receiving learning outcomes, what are your views on a social impact bond with the government having a stake in paying for those outcomes? You talk about public-private partnership, and I think that's a great way for the government and an NGO to become involved.
I will forget if. Can I answer that? Because it will be difficult for me to recall the question. I am growing old, unlike you.
Yes.
Can I? Because they are very pertinent questions.
Yes.
I am so glad that you pointed towards the complexity of this issue. Throughout my career in the civil service, I have looked at issues over which I have control. I can certainly prescribe as to what needs to be done. It's the easiest advice I have. Tell somebody else what needs to be done. Can we think, and I'm trying to do that. I have done that in my previous assignments. Build institutions which are outside such domains which are not in my control. So for example, I know I will retire on the 30th of June this year. Now I have to build an institution which outlasts me. The guys who are non-transferable. So what I normally do is to create, so to say, vested interest around the idea that I have. If that happens, it sustains. Education, I'm new to it, I've just put a year. But in coal, I can guarantee that the systems that we've created, no one can ever mess up with it. And I'm hopeful that in education also, wherever what we are attempting to do, we will try and create such institutions which are, I won't say insulated from the problems that you mentioned, transfers and all, but we can create. For example, there are non-governmental organizations that form the core of the group that I constitute to run a particular idea. They are non-transferable. But I can't guarantee they will not be badgered into running away.
Correct.
But if that doesn't happen, it will sustain. The question is, the ultimate question is the value proposition that I associate along with the idea that I have. And if I have buyers for that value proposition, it will sustain. So the key is whether I'm able to create that value proposition. And value proposition could be anything. I mean, it's in the context of recognition of that NGO or the people who are associated with it to sustain what they are doing. To appreciate the fact that its impact is such that they feel good about it. So there are various ways in which you can do that. It's difficult, but to my mind it's doable. And madam, your question regarding the bonds, again in my entire career I've never had problem with money. Money had been forthcoming. Why can't we get the idea of outcome-based funding in government funding itself?
Absolutely.
Why should I float a bond? And let me tell you, we've started it this year. I'm a practical man, I'm not a revolutionary, otherwise I would have had a jhadu in my hand. I'm a revolutionary. So what we've done here is, this year, we have earmarked 20% of our budget for outcome-based allocation to state governments. A beginning has been made for the first time during the next financial year. And we have also laid a roadmap that this will keep on increasing 5% every year. Now someone will say, what will 20% do? Of course. But as I said, I go step by step. We moved in that direction. We are going to demonstrate that this is going to positively impact education in the country, create a value proposition around it for it to sustain. It may not, but there are things beyond your control, you can't help it. I'd like to not have sleepless night over that. Thank you.
Okay, more questions on this side.
Thank you for your insights. My question for the panel at large. We heard about disruption when it comes to access to education. What are your thoughts on disruption in curriculum design itself? Are the skills that we are teaching our children keeping up to pace with the needs of the 21st century? So we'd love to hear your thoughts on curriculum design.
My question is again to Mr. Swaroop.
I should have come with an armor today.
Just a quick one. So you mentioned in your talk that it's not about structures or conventions and more about attitude shift. So do you think that deserves more discussion along with the data? And perhaps those two can come together to solve the problem more efficiently?
I've been wanting to come together. I get to meet her only in twice in.
Three.
Can we have a couple more? Yes.
So the World Bank or UNICEF recently released a report that said that about 48% of Indian children have cognitive stunting as a result of inadequate nutrition, meaning that they can't possibly achieve their cognitive potential without adequate nutrition. So I'm wondering how important you perceive in collaborating with nutrition or like nutritional organizations and including nutrition in your innovations for achieving the potential educational improvements that you're aiming for.
If you want to take the first
So
one.
let's start with the first one.
Yeah, and
Uh,
I think related to what you were saying about nutrition as well.
Yes, exactly.
Sorry. Before I followed my.
Thank you.
So I think really important points there. So in terms of innovations in the learning piece, so there are two. I see it as two parts to the educational journey, right? First, you learn to read, and then you read to learn. Yeah. Our work is very much focused on the first, and as you mentioned with Asad, a lot of the crisis is happening even in that first phase of learning to read. working in the most marginalized areas, we realize that because of the cognitive, abilities being impaired due to malnutrition or stunting and stuff like that, our kids cannot. They will lag behind because it's just much harder for them to learn. But because we have this results-based focus, one of the things we started to do is we brought in pedagogy experts who are not actual, the regular primary elementary school pedagogy experts. We built a bridge course with special needs educators. Because we've just said, these are guys who can get autistic and Down's kids to, pass the 10th grade exam. It's a very different way of teaching, yeah? And we said that our children are also special needs because of extreme social and economic marginalization, right? So the entire pedagogy has been built with that lens. And what we're seeing is, you have to just break it down into micro skills and micro steps, and all those micro skills have to come in the right order for a child to be able to learn. So for example, they're not going to be able to learn subtraction with carryover if you haven't spent adequate number of sessions teaching them place value. And to do place value, there's a whole other 10 sessions that you have to do. Unless you cover those skills, you will not get onto the higher skills. And most of the time, that is what is missing. And so that first journey itself, and because they're lagging behind, there's so many gaps, they can't do higher skills, they can't do a division, they can't do fractions and whatever else, and then they drop out because you're having a really, really difficult time. So I think one of the innovations we did was to look at our children as special needs kids and to build the content and the curriculum very much keeping that in mind. So that takes care of the nutrition, it takes care of the stunting, it takes care of all the lags.
Coming back to the curriculum point and to also probably bring in Gayatri here, from your Teach for India experience, what do you think is the solution for the curriculum lags? A lot of times the curriculum itself, a lot of debate is there on the history-based curriculum as well in India and what are we actually taught. I think Amish before this also brought that up. But what do you think? Do you think that is at all a concern, or pedagogical concerns are probably more primary right now to deal with?
Okay, this is going down a very slippery slope in terms of what our curriculum should be. And I don't want to get into that. Having said that, I think what our curriculum really lacks is teaching children to be better human beings. So just like a values-based learning versus what history books teach you. All of that, I think, actually if it's embedded in the right values, things children can learn on their own. So how do you teach empathy? How do you teach children to be people who just want to keep learning? Right? How do you teach children to get along with everybody? And I think these are skills, if we can imbibe in our kids and our curriculum actually focuses on that, we can solve a lot of the other curriculum being forced on us.
Thank you, fantastic.
Can I just add to
Yes.
that a little bit?
Yes.
Just one thing, we're now doing a public-private partnership with SIERT and in Rajasthan, but really around exactly what you said, but saying life skills should not be a separate program. Say come to this period and you will learn empathy and yeah. You can't teach gender equity as a separate thing. So we're working with them to actually revamp the textbooks so that all of these pieces are built into your regular curriculum. So if you're doing a math sum and saying my father came home with 10 laddus and he gave he kept 4 and he gave my brother 4 and then 2 were for the mother and sister, also looking at not just the arithmetic but looking at the gender equity piece and asking some questions saying was it equal, how does it make you feel and all of that. So really kind of embedding it and making the learning curriculum, literacy, numeracy also much richer.
Fantastic.
What questions? Yes, I'm going to go to that side of the room.
Good afternoon. Thanks a lot for the valuable information. So the question I have, because I did my schooling from India also, government school, and did my master from there, and again second master from here. So one thing over there, which I noticed, the small children, in the 5th grade, 6th grade, too much pressure to the exam. And I heard especially during the exam time, so many little children, they lose, doing losing their lives. So why not because little bit and if we distribute the system overall because even right now the teachers and everyone, they focus to the exam. And if you miss one chance, so it is very much like, pressure for the kids. So is any like, in that direction thought or anything like, to improvement?
Can I add something? Just adding data to that, I'm a psychiatrist from Hyderabad. In the last 2 years, there has increase of 263% in the suicides of the children between the age 0 to 15. And since previously it was more concentrated in the urban areas, now it is spreading to the rural and the tribal areas. So, and also at the same time, the data says that the education system has spread. So, is the education system making the children to commit suicide?
So, I just want to add to his question. I have been teaching in high schools from last 11 years in India and in US, public schools from last 4 years in US. So I understand what's the difference between Indian culture of teaching because I've been taught there, but I have also taught high school students and middle school students here. So his part is truly right because I graded my students also in the high schools and how Gayatri and Safina's answers match to it. Like we have to embed empathy and emotional attachment on how we as teachers, I'm not a teacher anymore, but I'm a speaker in the high schools right now. We as a teacher who are in US, how we can cross-culturally communicate this thing to the students because principals are also the essential point of contact that we should teach because teaching principals will increase more efficiency. So is there a way that we can make anything together? People from here, the teachers from here who are Indians, they can come there or we can present some kind of talks which can motivate and just not stress on the exams. Because I have also my siblings who are fighting this every day.
Right, thank you. I think the first part, Mr. Swaroop, could you take that and then Gayatri, let's come to you for the...
I think you hit the nail on the head. It's too much pressure on the children. Not only pressure, the weight also. My problem is that almost everybody wants everything in the curriculum. So traffic people want it, environment people want it, Swachhata Abhiyan want it, formal curriculum. Everyone wants it. बस मेरा कर दो, बाकी रहने दो. लेकिन बस्ता का वजन कम करो. It's a huge dilemma that you have. That is one. Number two, I think most of your observations are based on what you've seen in urban areas. I have a totally different problem in rural areas. In fact, when British left this country, they took justice with them, I said, no. They left behind laws, in-laws and outlaws. So we came up with this Right to Education Act. Now what has this done? It dispensed with detention. So schools interpreted as dispensed with examination. Now you have children going up to class 10 knowing nothing. Now ideally, there should not be examinations. But practically, if I were not to give an exam, I wouldn't have studied, I am telling you. I don't know how many of you would have studied. I studied for the exams. That's the culture of the country and I can't change it by changing the curriculum. So that will happen, so we'll have to have exams. But I totally agree with you. And unfortunately, the ladies sitting here did not participate in that workshop that we had in Delhi. One full day workshop. I mean, I'm aghast as these days because they won't perhaps be aware also that we had a 4-day long workshop on values, ethics, gender sensitization, as also how do we include it as a part of the curriculum, precisely in the manner in which she suggested, not as a separate chapter. Had you been there, probably you would have given and endorsed the idea that I also had, that it should be a part of the regular curriculum without ethics. And that is one thing that I started from day one as education secretary. Because I also felt, what is this happening to the value system? I mean, we don't even talk about it. Leave alone part of the curriculum, just not talked about. So fortunately, there is this awareness. And my other suggestion to you would be, don't quote me outside, don't mess up too much with curriculum. There could be other dangers around. Let it be the way it is. I'm fighting it to retain the curriculum that we have. Let it be there, because once you get into this danger of revising curriculum, you don't imagine what's going to happen. So let it be there for a while. Let's prioritize our problems in the country. To my mind, curriculum is a problem, but it's not there. There are other problems. Let's address those issues. Let's look at the quality of education that we are delivering. And I don't think the existing curriculum is responsible for poor quality of education. There are other factors. Let's focus on that. And if you don't prioritize, we'll continue to talk about everything and do nothing for 10 years. And we have oft repeated that survey that's going on. My friends, there's another survey that has happened that is telling us today why things are wrong. It's not merely telling they are wrong. So we have a competence-based survey of 22 million children in the country, the biggest ever in the world now. And we are going to devise district-wide plan to understand what are the pedagogical problems, what are the curriculum-related problems. So it's easier now for us to understand the why of a problem. Rather than merely telling a problem is the easiest thing. You know, you get quoted all over the world telling that this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. Everyone will say, look at that survey, it says it's still wrong. But that survey, have you tried to understand whether that survey tells me what is wrong and how it can be corrected? It doesn't. It is only when you do this competency-based survey that you really understand what's going wrong where, and we've done it for 22 million children.
So to address your question on how do we prepare teachers and principals to be able to build a system like this, right? So I think that's definitely something that we're trying to do. Again, to give you another example, also from Telangana, surprisingly, principal was working with, again, a Dalit school for girls. One of the girls was caught stealing clips. Right? Even that was a big treasure for her. So she was reprimanded and then she committed suicide. And in her suicide note, she said, I blame the principal for embarrassing me in front of the whole school. The principal obviously was devastated, said, I never want to do this job again. I have been responsible for someone's life. Anyway, long story short, she's back to being a principal now, 2 years later, and has the most focus on values. And she's realized that, why did this girl do this? She did it because she's seeking attention. She doesn't have parents. She has no one to shower love on her, and therefore she does this. So she was working with other school principals. These are people who finished the program in Iceland. They have this professional learning circle where they learn from each other. And she was talking about how it's just love and care that these kids are craving for. So I don't mean to undermine your solution of bringing teachers from America and telling the teachers in India what to do. I just think there are solutions within us. But to Mr. Swaroop's point, we need to think about how to scale these solutions. And bringing individual or a few, ideas and thoughts from across the world. I have seen from my personal experience, completely anecdotal, when you get an idea from outside India, the automatic reaction is, but context is different, it doesn't work. So I think finding solutions, which there are plenty within the country, is what we need, and scaling that up and spreading the word is going to help solve things.
Beautiful. So, paucity of time, guys. So, we would probably take one more question, and that's it.
So I have an offer to make. If they have a room somewhere, I can sit down and take questions because nothing else to do.
Fantastic.
Behind you. Behind you.
Press question.
I'm going to take you up on your offer, sir. I'm speaking from behind you, so, but I really appreciate all the wonderful comments you made. I just had a quick comment, is that to your point, I think you really made beautiful points about the Navodaya Vidyalayas, the Kendriya Vidyalaya. I'm a Kendriya Vidyalaya product, by the way. So, yeah. And one of the problems I think that I see, by the way, I am executive director now for Ekal Vidyalaya, which is a very scaled organization. Thank you, yeah. So, but the problem is that when you talk, in any panels, or you don't hear about Navodaya Vidyalayas, you don't hear about Ekal Vidyalaya, because what they measure as success is slightly different. And I think this is the case even when I now go look at whether it is Acer report or anything else, the outcome that is measured is about, and reading and writing are important, I'm not denying that, but even Gayatri just now said, right? Success is, we went to Ames, we came to America. How do we transform the problems in our, and how do we change those measures? Because if we change those measures, I think people will start talking about Navodaya Vidyalayas, about Ekal. And another last point also, when I saw Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, I think was taken a little bit from Ekal. And the idea was that, localized teacher, let's take them, let's run the, beautiful, but the investment went into building this building and getting this teacher from the city, who is not a bad person, but how can she thrive in my village, right? And it didn't succeed. So the pilot, if you think of ACLE as a pilot, it was a large pilot. It could not be replicated because how do you measure a school that has no building? So these are the kinds of questions that I had for you. So thank you for...
They are the answers, actually.
Well, thank you, sir, for bringing up... so outcomes was what I was asking about, the measure. And the monies that go into it, how do we validate the right outcomes to that money?
Totally agree.
I think I would take your point on the money that's going into it and how do we validate the outcomes for that money. On that note, any closing remarks from Dhan, Susanna, Gayatri, as well as Sabina?
Just on the point of outcomes, I think you've raised an absolutely valid point, and it really is about defining the right outcomes. And finally, the money will come for outcomes that as locally defined. But I think definitely value-based curriculum, looking at 21st century skills, this cannot be denied, but we also really need to be very aware of the fact that we do have a serious situation on our hands where we are lacking basic literacy and numeracy. And so, you sort of want to pile everything onto that basket and get everything done, but really getting the basics right is going to be critical for us.
This has been a fascinating conversation for me to listen to. I think sort of one of my takeaways is that I think there's a slight conflict between the concepts of disruptive innovation and massive scale, which is what you're trying to do. So, you look at disruptive innovations, and I often see innovations developed and tested in California or London being sort of proposed for Delhi or rural Madhya Pradesh, and they might work really well in London or in San Francisco, and they probably won't work in rural Madhya Pradesh. So sort of question one, does it work? And question two, does it work in more than one place? But then sort of third and fourth, is there the capacity to implement those wonderful innovations in systems that are sort of strained? So does Madhya Pradesh have the sort of plumbing within the bureaucracy to actually roll out and scale these things that have worked really well in San Francisco or London? And then sort of the point that you've made, Mrs. Swarup, is it actually politically feasible to try and scale them? And I think many of us have tried very hard to kind of implement reforms that just aren't, in India and elsewhere, that just aren't politically feasible. And I've seen that sort of play out time and time again in London, where I'm from, and in many other places. And I think so just finally, one very brief comment on the 21st century skills and curriculum piece. I think that I just couldn't agree more with what Sabina said. I think sort of kids can't read, they can't access learning and curriculum later on in life. And I spent a day talking to educators and funders thinking about secondary education in Africa, and I kept hearing about blockchain and Bitcoin and 21st century skills, and wanted to kind of say that they can't read. And I think sort of we know how to teach kids how to read, and figuring out how to scale that is just kind of the most important thing that all of us should be trying to do.
I think so. When I got into the sector, I came with very idealistic thoughts that I'm going to change the world. And the funny thing is, I still think that we can do that. So I think the debate is not for me whether it's important to focus on values and skills or whether it's important to focus on learning outcomes. I think it's both. I think we need to help. The reality is these kids need to get jobs. They need to go to an AIMS. They need to get into medical college, and the academics is going to help them get there. But you also want doctors and dentists and everybody with the right values, and therefore for me it's not an either or, it's a both. And I think I continue to remain optimistic because I've seen the dialogue and the narrative change from when I first got into Teach for India and I was raising funds, and funders would say, can we sponsor 5,000 water bottles, to funders now talking about learning outcomes. I think that's a fantastic narrative change.
Just to add to what Gayatri said, I don't think there's an either or. I think everything has to be done. We have to look at learning, we have to look at access and leadership and all the inputs, and yet have a focus on outcomes. And I think really just to leave with the fact that if we don't, the problem is huge, but if we don't, every year we fail our children, is that their future dims a little bit. if we don't come together and if we don't take action. So really just keeping that in mind, it is our children's future at stake. And therefore, coming together and doing whatever we can to make sure that their future is bright, that they will have the, doors of opportunity open to them.
Thank you. So would you, like to put in like one final comment?
No, I would only mention to you a couple of disruptive initiatives that I plan to take in the time that I have. One is with regard to looking at the voucher system, looking at whether the private sector, or at least some of them, can do better than the government sector, because accountability is the key there. Here we have a bit of an issue there, but I don't know whether it will be politically possible. I have managed to convince a couple of state governments who have agreed to do it. Let's see if it happens. And the second, which Madam said, my personal view is that the teacher should come from the village, so that she or he does not want to get transferred. Half the time of the administration is spent on transfers and the court cases related to it. I've been floating this idea for a while. Some states have agreed in principle, but I hope they implement it, because some of you may not even imagine what this problem is. Because if the teacher is not there mentally and physically, then what about curriculum and values? I mean, who's going to teach about it? So that's the fundamental problem. So we are trying to address some of these fundamental issues, but I must thank the university for inviting me here and this lovely panel. I got a lot of input. I'm taking a lot of notes. I implement ultimately, and got to be implemented.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Right before we leave, I had a personal question to ask you. Your colleague told you that if you go into the coal sector, that's like the gangs of Basarpur, if you watch that movie. What would you say for the education sector now that you're in it?
No, I missed my second comment there. Okay. Someone asked me, how do you feel in the education sector after a month? I said in coal, mining was underground and mafias were overground. In education, it's the other way around. All the mafias are done underground. And there is a war there. I have not mentioned about it. We have, out of 1,600 B.Ed colleges, 16,000 B.Ed colleges, 4,000 do not exist. They give you a degree, and if you pay them well, they give you a naukri as well. So what sort of teachers are we going to get? That's one mafia. There are about 3 of them. I can name them, but I don't want to discuss it. Thank you.
Yeah, we leave with a bit of optimism on that note, but thank you so much for being here. Thank you.